how we absorb information, if it's a real person delivering the message versus something that, well, we perceive it to be real, it's actually artificial, or even if there's such a study that has been done.
Yeah, if I want to mirror it to something that comes to mind, there is these children YouTube videos these days. I'm talking like very young and etc. Whether for language development, and then I don't remember her name. Like there is one very famous, which is for kids growing up and spelling and stuff like that. That is, it is human, like right, who is performing, but the interface is virtual. The interface is not human. And yet there is learning is happening, right? Developmentally, the outcome is there, and kids are reacting and interacting with it. They're not passive. And I think that's a really interesting dimension into this on the dissemination of the content. It's not that I think there is a certain age group where that might not work, but at least very early, it seems to be working. And in some cases, doing much better job than the parents to some extent. And definitely, if we look at Coursera and some of all the coaching business and everything else with these courses or etc., it's you're literally interacting with a human. You are, but you're not as well. It's like a pre-recorded message, so you're interacting with the output, which is a virtual output at the end of the day, and trying to build a competence based on that, right?
Mm.
And there is varying degrees of success there. At least it's acceptable as a notion, even though today we still feel it's a human being behind that virtual screen. But at the end of the day, the outcome is a completely virtual interface,
Yeah.
right?
So we were talking about slightly different things, which is one, let's say learning a course on Coursera, which is a human delivering it virtually, and one, the same professor delivering it in person. But the other version is where it's not a real person at all, and it's delivering it, whether it's a hologram perspective or in a video format like Coursera. And those are three different scenarios that, and I'm not denying that it's possible to learn from the other, from a virtual, from an online presence, whether it's a human that's on that online presence or a hologram or an AI or something. I just wonder if there is a gap at all in terms of receptiveness of absorption of knowledge. No, I mean, of course, people learn stuff online at the moment. I just wonder, is like, what's the effectiveness? What's the depth of knowledge? Or don't know.
No, but I think that's an interesting, it's an interesting problem, right? And because we don't know what the gap is, like, right? We don't know clearly is there value, is the value diminishing when we are delivering the content online? Because especially if it's not live, where you don't have the possibility to interact, you could as much as well, like, replace it with an AI, which is mimicking some of the emotions and the delivery. And you could say it is the same, especially if you didn't know. You could say it could deliver the same, because on the outset, from whoever is me sitting in front of it, it's just whether can I connect with it. And the reason I say that is because I still, I've heard, I don't know if I think I mentioned this before, this Notebook LLM, when it did a podcast with my book. I gave it my book as an input, and it just created the podcast.
Yeah.
And these two AIs were talking to each other, and it sounded like very human, like engaging human storytelling, not even like, they're giving anecdotes and they're joking about things. And honestly, it was much more interesting than just reading or just reading passively. It was engaging to a certain extent. And this, I would say, is still early on. Like, right, we're not far enough into the technology. This is very early days, and it's still delivering something which is decent. So imagine that kind of relationship, whether through dialogue, now we don't have to have one teacher. We can have two teachers having a dialogue about a subject, or a teacher and a student, because we can see the interaction and like I think probably what I was thinking is that the opportunity scope on what that, and how that delivered can change from just a teacher to student, but could be teacher to student, projecting on a student in a way.
So are you, you see it that let's say each individual in 10 years, each individual student will have their own AI teacher, let's say. And at some point, how does that then, maybe I missed the point about where, how does that work then on the other students? Because if each student has their own AI, Are they getting the same type of information, the same knowledge? And then how do they then come together again, student to student, human student to human student, to work together to solve a problem or even to collaborate on a project? I wonder if that will raise any issues or challenges.
Think it will raise opportunities in a way, at least the way I see it, right? Because I think those are the gaps that you're preparing those students for, right? Instead of just the material. So the interactions where you want student to student without the AI, or kind of facilitated possibly by the AI for a group session, you're kind of preparing for those engagements in the one-on-one sessions, like, right, where it's catered learning. They don't necessarily need to be studying the same thing, in the sense, as long when the collaboration happens, their collaboration on solving a problem, but their level of understanding of the problem scope or etc., I think can vary, like, right, where you are, or you are matched actually, like, then we move from, you're forced to the same group of people to be matched depending where you are, to group sessions to that same level.
Right. Yeah.
The model becomes more dynamic. So today the model is very constrained by, you start with this class and you kind of continue with this class unless you skipped or jumped, kind of.
Yeah.
But then we're no longer, we don't need to be stuck in that model at all, actually. The structure of the classroom can be more dynamic. And then you are simply mapped to whoever is a little bit, or don't need to be exactly at the level, but at a level enough to challenge each other or to be able to engage in that conversation. Then they are matched together. And then we have a much more dynamic system as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be quite interesting, actually. Because that will also make it a lot easier that the students, one student wouldn't get bored, or one student will feel very left out or something like that. Yeah. And actually that raises something that, well, because a lot of times now students are, let's say, public schools, there's a very mixed level of students in a certain classroom. But if you are then matched with someone from a completely different area, but your same level of learning, that makes it a lot more engaging for the student. But then it also removes the problem of wanting to be in a certain school zone area, for example, because it doesn't matter that then. It's like, oh, I want to be in this area because all the students are of this level, perceived at this level, for example. It would improve some of the housing price bubbles in certain zones, because schools are perceived to have higher levels of learning, for example.
I think that
just went off on a tangent there, but
no, but I think that's an excellent point, like, right, because what the physical space of where you are, becomes less relevant as a consequence of that kind of structure and that kind of system, which is dynamic to your needs and can be anywhere or any place for the most part. So, and I think that takes us to jumping, to, the kind of the solutions of barriers, or like, specific zones, and what does that look and mean in the future, right? Both from a globalization perspective or nationalistic perspective, which I think is a dimension which will be brought on whether we like it or not. And which is, I think, taking the main scene today, whether we like it or not, whether from a resistance standpoint or from a kind of pushing towards it.
Yeah. And so in this instance, and well, students will be in a virtual classroom together. They need not be in the same city or the same country even. And they could be learning, or even the same time zone.
And they are already today in games and virtual rooms all the time.
Yeah.
Like, right, if you think about it, like, children are playing online games worldwide, and they are in practically virtual rooms.
Yes, I think so. Yeah. Dealing with different avatars and
so, and in some cases even talking, not necessarily just through the avatars that they are presenting, but as well through language. And they could be in different countries, and so it's interesting that some of these systems already exist, but not necessarily connected in a way in the more established mainstream, I would say, kind of industries, but they do exist in disparate kind of areas, but they haven't kind of came together for the most part.
Yeah, exactly. But the behavior and the acceptability of that exists.
Exactly.
So which means the adoption is not as far off as we would think.
Yeah, it's more like a nudge of being available rather than, and onboarding properly in places where it's acceptable a little bit more. So I think the resistance will not be from the students, like, to a certain level. Like the resistance probably will come from parents and the historic structures, which we believe, can only deliver value before we can trust new structures to deliver value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then moving on to I guess like we've gone through the creation,
Dissemination.
and now it's assessment.
So the assessment is like the feedback loops. And I think this is honestly where the human touch is necessary. And I say that because I see this a little bit different in the future, at least. This is where I see things coming to practicalities in workforce or in life or in real kind of examples. So today a test measures a kind of a fictitious kind of structure of what you can and cannot do, right? It is a representation model. At the end of the day, it is not an actual problem to solve, whether it's an assessment or etc. And in some cases, one step in addition to that is a simulated setup. If you engage in a simulated setup, it's as well another fictitious kind of model, which is trying to take you through what you learn and see if you're able to engage and deliver. So I think there is three modes. One, which is, and I think we see that in healthcare very clearly. And I think that's the model there exists in much more visceral than anywhere else. There is the assessments, the checklist, and your tests. There is the simulation where you go and do skills lab or do certain things where you're trying, but you're not actually doing things on the patient. And then there is the apprenticeship or the residencies where you're actually engaging in patient setup, but with someone who's kind of guiding or governing over a period of time. And I see that those three hopefully will be part of the feedback loops in much smaller cycles and sprints, not on much longer wide ones.
No, I was going to say I agree with that. I think because going back to what you said before, if we're going to use some of this, what you call them as feedback loops, in order to improve or refine the content creation part, we need to have it, I think, shorter and closer together in order that we can adapt it much faster.
And hence we redesigned the whole system.
Not bottom up, but how AI can help us.
Well, I think, AI is, since we said the first two pieces are predominantly all AI, the third piece is where the human starts to play most.
Yeah. I mean, we're shifting a lot of that because in order to do the system that we're suggesting, it requires a lot more energy and engagement from an educator in order to assess whether or not a child has that knowledge to progress to the next level. Yeah, it requires a lot more concentration even to say, all right, do they have all these different pieces? It's very different from marking a paper, for instance, because there's only one right.
Right, but I think that's where AI can help as well, because it can abstract and extrapolate some of these data points and give more insight into what has happened, which is not something necessarily we do a good job. Right, it can capture the communications that has been happening in any format that it can capture, whether in audio or video, some of the cues. And that does not mean that the AI in this case is making the assessment, because here there is much more nuance in the relationships and what that looks like. But in the presentation, right, and delivering some of these data points, I think there is an opportunity here for AI to play as well, where its job is more to extract and present the data, less so to, and summarize it of longer period of time rather than actually, making an assessment of it. Right, because here the assessment could be different things based on what the educator sees in those interactions or in those delivery or challenges or how they were addressed, right? Today Otter or any of those summarizes a meeting notes and gives you the next steps and things like that. That summary, you can interpret it however you want to and take actions on it however you want to, but it still makes it much easier to skim through. And if you want to dial in and say, oh, okay, this is interesting, you can do that. So it removes some of that cognitive load on the educator as well. Not that they still don't have an important job, they do, but now that's where the tool augments. That's where AI augments, doesn't necessarily replace.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Agreed.